You already know the story before I tell it to you. Breaking Bad, along with its protagonist Walter White, has become deeply engraved within our current pop culture to the point where even those who have never actually watched the show have managed to digest the property through various critics singing its praises, seeing all the memes, and never hearing other people shut up about it. But is Breaking Bad really that good? Yes. Yes, it is. I think it captures something very specific about human nature and life struggles that many people, regardless of age, gender, or even that much life experience, can find something within the show to latch onto, especially those living in America and other Western countries. It's a show that delivers on expressing the dark fantasies that we perhaps wouldn't be able to live out in our own lives, but can watch vicariously as others do it, and yet at the same time, it never really glorifies it to a point where there's a lack of consequences. Every decision the characters make have a ripple effect that continues throughout its entire run. Every episode has a point, yes, even the Fly episode, and at 62 episodes total, it's just long enough to be able to invest in a worthwhile journey, but not too long that it wears out its welcome and gets old and stale. It also is incredibly unique in that it's able to expand on its concepts and characters to a degree that every season gets progressively better. Many shows peak early on or have that one season that stands out above the rest. But if you ask most Breaking Bad fans, the majority of them will say that the final season, season 5, is the best. And a few more will say season 4. And very, 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 very few people would say season 1. However, season 1 is still excellent, and I can't understand those that say they weren't hooked by the very first episode. Because for me, I was on board right from the get-go. In fact, the first 3 episodes of season 1 are such a fucking roller coaster ride of intensity, dark humor, and an exploration on the human condition that was all I needed to get on board for the entire ride to take me into the very depths of despair. But in a fun way. So let's go back in time and take us to a simpler era, 2008, before the giant drug cartels, the prison assassinations, or meth empires, and let's look at what started this whole journey and why it seems to resonate so much with so many people. Episode 1 puts us into the perspective of our lead character, Walter White, beginning actually on his 50th birthday. This is a man who we recognize right away at being extremely intelligent. Some could say he could be teaching at esteemed colleges, but instead is working a grind at a high school teaching chemistry filled with students who don't respect him in the slightest. He's struggling to keep up with his bills, his oldest son is dealing with cerebral palsy, and his wife is currently pregnant with their second child. He's forced to work a second job at a car wash with a boss that always makes him stay late, and Walt, despite all of these things affecting him negatively, just accepts it. He is a docile and weak man that seems as though he will forever be unable to crawl out of this hole, making matters worse when he suddenly passes out, only to awake and be told that he's living with lung cancer and might not have that much longer to live, let alone the funds to pay the expenses to treat it. All of these things, I think, play into why Breaking Bad has become the phenomenon that it is, because Walter White, at first, represents that feeling of defeat, especially for those that believe that things are too far gone, that believe that they're unable to change their life situation. Their big opportunities are in the past, and all that is left is for them to ride out the rest of their lives hoping to support their family with what they can. But that feeling of struggling within this middle-class income, with the feeling of responsibility weighing down on you, and the realization that you may never get another break again, desperation starts to set in. And thus we spell the beginning of the end. Walt takes to using his skills as a chemist to create the best and most pure crystal meth possible in order to try to sell it and make as much money as he can to leave behind for his family, teaming up with a former student named Jesse Pinkman who knows the streets and is able to sell, but he also dabbles in the meth itself and sometimes is too focused on getting a good high than being responsible. Jesse comes from a good family but fell into drugs and never managed to crawl his way out of it. And I think a lot of us have known a Jesse Pinkman in our lives. Somebody who isn't a bad person, but also is so far into drugs that they seem like they're a lost cause and not someone you really want to hang out with anymore. Jesse's greatest strength is that he has compassion still and he's able to tell right from wrong. He's not so deep into it that he's lost his morality other than being able to sell life-destroying chemicals to other people, but he himself also indulges in them, so there's a disconnect with just how bad what he's doing actually is. But the reality check comes soon, as Walt's meth is seen as too good, and a couple of thugs make Jesse take him to their cook site, and this leads into the disaster of the first 3 episodes. Walt uses a chemical mixture to knock them both out. It manages to kill one, but the other one, named Crazy 8, is still alive. So the question becomes, what do you do now? How does this old man and young junkie, 1, dispose of a human body, and 2, gather up the courage in order to kill another person? And at this point in the series, they have no resources, no special phone calls to cartel members, no criminal lawyer on speed dial. These episodes are filled with an incredible amount of humor also, as Walt and Jesse argue and fight between one another about the best way to handle the situation, and also what happens when Jesse, who isn't as scientifically minded as Walt, doesn't think he needs to follow the instructions exactly, and it results in a bathtub of slowly disintegrating human flesh breaking through the ceiling of his house and crashing onto the floor. I love the beginning of episode 3 and how it reflects back to Walt in college speaking with Gretchen about the makeup of a human body. It kind of reminds me of Full Metal Alchemist, as they write down the percentages of everything within the body and intercut it with Walt and Jesse cleaning up the mess that they had caused, dehumanizing someone to nothing more than liquid garbage being flushed down a toilet. Even more so does the episode challenge the value of life when Walt contemplates how to kill Crazy 88. He killed Emilio quickly within an act of self-defense, but premeditating and actively planning out a murder is a different story than a quick self-defense moment. Ultimately, Walt doesn't want to do it. Walt may become a monster as time goes on, but here in Season 1, this 50-year-old guy who has never done anything illegal in his whole life, put into a position where, if he lets this man go, he risked the lives of himself and his entire family. To me, Walt killing Crazy 8 was one of the most heart-wrenching moments of the season because he doesn't want to do it. And he knows the only reason he's here in this position was his own decision to begin cooking meth in the first place. And at the time, he didn't tell his family that he was even sick yet. He was trying to solve a problem without them even knowing, and now he's a murderer. Ending the episode with a flashback once again of Walt and Gretchen and them missing just a little bit of what makes up a person, with Gretchen mentioning maybe it's the human soul, just as Walt is beginning to lose his own. And you would think this experience would be enough to stop you from wanting to make drugs. And it was, actually. Walt and Jesse both stop and they go their separate ways. Until episode 5, which is called Gray Matter, which I believe is single-handedly probably the most underrated episode and the best episode to understand Walter White as a character, especially in this beginning portion. It introduces his college friend Elliot and his wife, Gretchen. And though there is no specific chain of events that are mentioned, and even though Walt does legitimately love his wife Skylar, you know somewhere down the line there was a breakup, and not only is she with his friend, but that friend also owns an extremely profitable company named Gray Matter, a company that Walt supposedly had a hand in creating initially before it was one of the most successful companies out there and he sold off his portion. But here's the thing. Elliot seems to have no bad blood with Walter whatsoever and actually views him as a friend. But as soon as we learn this bit of information, we get it. Walt fucked up in his past, and ever since he has been trying to make up for these failures, but all the while being extremely bitter about it. And though he tried to ignore it, and he tried to ride through life, and he tried to just accept it, it burns him from within. Walt views himself just as, if not more superior than Elliot, that he is the one that deserves the success. He deserved the business. He deserved the legacy. But he would be too timid to ever bring this up. Until now. And while Elliot not only offers him a job and offers to literally pay for his cancer treatment, Walt turns him down. His entire problem could be fixed right here in this episode, but it would be fixed by accepting the help from somebody that he resents deep down in his heart, and his pride would not allow him to do it. Walt knows that he only has a few years to live, and within that time, he wants to find a way to pay for his treatment and leave money behind for his family. He wants it to be him that does it and nobody else. He wants his family to look towards him as the savior, not some random rich friend that he has. Walt wants to earn it for himself, and he wants that sense of power by doing it. And with the talking pillow scene, it becomes more apparent. Walt admits it in this episode. He says he feels like he's never been able to make his own decisions about anything. He talks about how he doesn't want treatment because of how much more weaker and sick it'll make him, and how they won't remember him as somebody to look up to or as a provider, and instead they'll remember him as this sick, dying person. Now, you can argue that Walt is purely selfish, or you can argue that Walt did do everything for his family, but actually both can be true. Do I believe that Walt truly wants to earn money for his family to make their lives better? Yes, of course, absolutely he does. Walt does love his wife. He does love his son. However, there is also an aspect that he wants to have that reciprocated respect by doing so. To not have his son call him a pussy, and to not have his wife be okay with just a lazy hand job. If Walt allowed Elliot to swoop in and be the hero, then Walt would never be able to be that hero. And with only a few years left to live, he cannot allow that. I'm not justifying Walt's decisions or his methods, but what I am saying is that I think people can understand where he's coming from in Season 1. At this point, even though the decisions are horrific and have tragic consequences, we understand the sentiments behind them. And this is what gets us on board for Walt's journey moving forward and helps us question our own morality as the seasons go on. And so Walt and Jesse, who is unable to commit to searching for a regular job again, decides that they're going to try cooking meth once more, which leads them into the life of a maniac named Tuco Salamanca. Tuco is a great antagonist. He's a great first antagonist to the series too, because he's still low level enough that we aren't involved with anything too crazy yet, but he also has a reputation and is connected to one of the most dangerous families in the Breaking Bad universe. He's less of a businessman and more of a loose cannon who just wants to show how in charge he is at all times, usually by example of violence. One of the best moments is after Tuco beats up Jesse to steal the meth, Walt confronts him. And this is right after Walt shaves his head for the first time due to the chemo, and it introduces us into the next era of his life. Calling himself Heisenberg and being willing to stand face to face with a true drug dealer. Walt is scared. He's out of his league, and he's physically much weaker than Tuco. But what he does have is his intellect, manufacturing a chemical compound to look like meth, but really, it's highly explosive. Walt throws some of it as an example and then threatens to blow all of them up, bluffing his way into getting Tuco to pay up for the drugs that he stole and to agree to future dealings. It's one of the most hype moments of the entire season. But Tuco isn't exactly one to be contained. In the season finale, he beats a man to death right in front of Walt and Jesse, basically showcasing to them that this is the world that they are locked into now, and this is the kind of man that they are doing business with. This psychopath is responsible for funding their operation, which again comes from Walt's recklessness of not wanting to sell the drugs piece by piece, but needing to sell it all at once. Now, there's also a lot of other characters that I haven't talked about because I wanted to focus mostly on Jesse and Walt, but Hank also becomes an extremely nuanced and important character. In Season 1, Hank is introduced as the outspoken brother-in-law of Walt, who just so happens to also work for the DEA. In the family dynamic, he represents that which Walt is not. Confident, working in a dangerous profession, somebody that his son Walter Jr. looks up to, and a guy that seems like he has his shit together. From the outside, anyway. Hank is investigating the new turnup of the super pure meth, but has no inclination towards Walt's involvement. Some people throughout the show's run wonder why Hank wouldn't suspect Walt, but I think it's pretty simple, because Hank already has a version of Walt in his mind. He views Walt as the world does, a simple and docile man, someone not even capable of being a criminal or killing a man in cold blood. We have Skylar White, Walt's wife, and I think that she gets a lot of shit from the fandom, but to be completely honest, I think a lot of what she does makes perfect sense from somebody in her position. In this season, she's pregnant, she has to deal with a condescending sister, and Walt disappears for hours on end only to find out that her husband has an extremely serious cancer. And as soon as she does, she begins trying her best to help him find the help that he needs. Is she the ideal wife? No, well, not to me. But Walt isn't exactly the ideal husband either. I think her character is just fine, and not nearly the best the show has to offer, but a sensible person that makes decisions and asks the questions that make sense of what this person would be going through at the time. I honestly think that she's very overhated in the fandom. Marie, I'm not going to spend too much time on. She has a bit of a superiority complex. It's kind of hard to tell if she's being really nice or fake nice, and she likes to steal things. Walter Jr., I mean, he just acts like a regular 15-year-old kid. He's a little bit mouthy, but he's a good dude. He also loves pancakes, and so do I. Overall, Season 1 of Breaking Bad has to establish the reason why someone who has never broken a law would decide to start selling drugs, and I think the exploration of the inferiority and desire for some semblance of power that Walt experiences is brilliantly shown to us as the audience, and it's not just the cancer that does it. It's the culmination of many things, but the cancer is the catalyst that allows him to justify his actions. There's some serious shit that goes down this season. There's murder, needing to dispose of bodies, and the introduction of a criminal like Tuco. But compared to the future of the series, Season 1 is very tame. The show will eventually expand to full-on drug cartel operations and beyond, but I also enjoy these simplistic beginnings of just trying to understand a man like Walt and the whys and hows of the beginning of this insanity. If you're like me, you were hooked from the very beginning, but I always tell people, if you watch Season 1 and you didn't love it, but you're at least on board with the concept and the characters, keep going, because from here, there's nowhere to go but up. But as for the characters, they haven't even begun to experience the tragedy that awaits them. Season 2 of Breaking Bad continues the tension that was built up in the Season 1 finale. Wanting to make as much money as possible, Walt and Jesse are dealing with Tuco Salamanca, somebody who is completely unstable, gets high on his own supply, and is willing to beat a man to death for the smallest of mistakes. But as all things, in this series, we have consequence. The death that Tuco caused leads the police to be on his tail, so Tuco takes it upon himself to get out of Dodge, but he kidnaps Walt and Jesse, planning to take them with him down to Mexico, to continue using Walt for his production of meth and contemplating killing Jesse because, well, he just doesn't like him. The tension that is in this episode 2 of the season called Grilled, it always had me on the edge of my seat from the first time I watched it up until now. How they try to get Tuco to take the poison meth but screw it up, and the uncertainty of how coherent Hector Salamanca actually is. This old guy that is completely spaced out, or seemingly so, but we find he is absolutely capable of both hearing and understanding, he's just unable to speak or stand. The sound of his bell for yes or no answers has somehow become this haunting sound that is synonymous with fear whenever we hear it ring within the series. And this is only the beginning of what Season 2 has to offer. The thing I love about this season in particular is its heavy emphasis on consequence, the butterfly effect of life, or causality if you want to call it that. How every tiny decision causes a current of change that sweeps across these characters' lives. A theme that is set up in the very beginning of the season, showing us these black and white snippets of something horrible that happened around Walter's house. Could it have been a police raid, a cartel attack, an explosion caused by a meth lab gone bad? We aren't really sure, and we aren't told until the final episode of the season, but the tease goes hand in hand with what this season is trying to tell us. Many events get put into motion due to the Tuco event in the beginning. Walt and Jesse do manage to finally get one over on him right before Jesse is about to be executed. My favorite moment is when Walt, having no leverage whatsoever, just breaks down and tells Tuco what he really thinks about him. And it's just such a ballsy move, since he might die any second from now. He just straight up tells him off, and I love it.
We tried to poison you because you're an insane, degenerate piece of filth, and you deserve to die.
But as luck or fate would have it, while searching for Walt, who was missing, Hank arrives on the scene. Walt and Jesse do manage to hide, but then Hank is locked in a firefight with Tuco unexpectedly and just narrowly mows him down. Now, Hank in Season 1 can be seen from the outside as a bit of a stereotypical dick of a cop. He boasts himself up constantly, he makes off-color jokes at bad times, and he can't seem to take too much seriously. But in reality, most of this is an act, a defense mechanism that hides how unsure of himself he actually is. After the shootout with Tuco, Hank is praised and promoted at work, but deep down, he begins to suffer with intense PTSD and even begins to have panic attacks. But, of course, he hides it from everybody else, afraid to show that weakness to anybody around him or ruin this image of him being a hero. Taken even farther when he's promoted and moved to another district. He tries to continue his showboating nature, but the officers here aren't really buying it. Also, I love the cameo from Danny Trejo as their informant. An informant that gets his head chopped off and put onto a turtle that then explodes and rips another officer's legs off in the process. Yeah, when I tell you there's a scene that I didn't see coming, it's this one. But anyways, for Hank, his work persona was something that gave him confidence and value, and though he tried to downplay the shootout after the turtle bomb, he cracks. He recluses himself at home until it's Walt, of all people, that's able to motivate him to return to work. I really love all of the exploration of Hank's character in this season and taking him a lot further than the persona that he puts on in front of everybody else. That he really is a guy trying to do the right thing, and that in dangerous situations he is very capable, but he's not made of stone. These things have an effect on him that he carries with him, both mentally and physically, throughout the course of the season and for the rest of his life. But even the near-death drama of what Walt and Jesse experience was not enough to stop them from trying to continue their operation. With no connections and not wanting to try to find another Tuco to deal with, they agree to sell it little by little and incorporate more dealers. Enter the dream team of Skinny Pete, Badger, and Combo, Jesse's friends. I actually really like all three of these guys, and I realized while watching this season over that each one of them represents all of the terrible things that can happen to you if you try to deal drugs in progressive order of bad to worse. First, Skinny Pete gets robbed, which causes Jesse to have to go try to get their deserved money back to them, only to enter the home of a meth head couple and see the true horrors of what drug addiction can do to people. The poor child that's left by himself, dirty and unfed. And this is only slightly before Jesse starts to go through his own experience of the nightmares of drugs himself. Next, we have Badger as the next highest risk result when he gets busted by the cops. A great episode that also introduces the character of Saul Goodman. In this season, we don't get a lot of him, but we do get what we need to know for the beginning of his involvement. He takes bribes, he takes on clearly guilty clientele, and the man has connections. At the end of the first episode that he's introduced, he finds Walter White working at his school, saying that he hired a private investigator to track him down. Which is enhanced if you've seen Better Call Saul, because you know it was probably Mike that found him behind the scenes and actively warned Saul to not bother with this guy. But Saul has a similar resolve to make as much profit as possible. He knows there's a good product here with Walt, so he gets to know who he is, and later is the catalyst to introduce Walt to Gus Fring. Gus, who has very little screen time in Season 2, but makes a huge presence in just one episode as a sophisticated businessman deeply connected with the drug trade, and hiding in plain sight. But this only happens because of our boy Combo. Yes, the third and highest setback for drug dealing, Combo is killed. He's killed by a child that was put up to it by someone much higher that we won't find out until next season. But by expanding their turf, somebody didn't like it, and Combo paid the price. This is what prompts Saul to try to introduce them to the big leagues, which is what brings us to Gus. But before all that happens, I want to talk about some very important things for Walt's character. First and foremost is his interaction with Gretchen in this season. Walt has been telling his wife that Gretchen and Elliot were the ones that were paying for his cancer treatment, something they offered to do, but Walt turned them down, wanting to earn it for himself. When Gretchen finds out Walt has been saying this, the two of them go out for a meal and talk it over, and we get some deep insights into Walt's convictions and his disdain for her. Walt insists that they cut him out of their corporation that went on to make millions, and that the company would have never gotten there without his contributions. Walt feels like they made all of that money based upon what he did. He's angry and bitter about it, not to mention there's a love triangle here between him, Gretchen, and Elliot that is only alluded to. And I like that the series doesn't spoon-feed you the answers. You get Walt's perspective and then Gretchen's surprise and a little bit of her side, and like with every story, it's nuanced. There's two sides, and then there's also the truth, which is somewhere in the middle. The truth is what we don't actually really get to see, but it seems as though Walt left Gretchen, supposedly feeling inferior to her already coming from a wealthy family and not having to earn it. Maybe he felt like he couldn't be the provider and it frustrated him. Though due to Walt's actions at the dinner, he seems to be spinning it that Gretchen got with Elliot and then they together cut him out of the company. But of course later we find out that Walt sold his portion of the company and let them have it. But like the Walt that we meet in the beginning, this would have been a much more docile and weak version of him that would do that and then in his head blame them even though it was his choice to sell his portion. There's so much conflicting emotion and it was clearly a complicated situation. But then we get probably the best fuck you ever delivered on film.
I feel so sorry for you, Walt.
Fuck you.
Walt is furious that Gretchen doesn't see the downside of what she may have done, and even more furious that she is feeling pity for him. That if she even knew half of what he had been through in his life, and especially within the past few months compared to the easy ride that she's had, and of course, I believe he once loved her as well, which makes it all the more difficult and intimate when that fuck you is delivered. It's a great scene, and I think one of the best in the show's run. The other great shifts and looks into Walt's psyche come with his medical condition in this season. The cancer diagnosis was the catalyst for needing to do something quick to make as much money as possible to leave behind, but that was the key to his justification for it, to leave behind. He with the understanding that he only had a short time left to live. And with that, he could ration away to himself whatever he had to do in some way because there would be only a finite time to do it in. In the episode 4 Days Out, which is a great episode itself, having Walt and Jesse kind of forced to deal with each other and find a way to get the RV moving again, but even more important is the end of the episode where Walt returns and gets the news that his cancer is in remission and he's on his way to making a full recovery, meaning he is going to have to live with the consequences of all of the decisions that he's made thus far. Dealing drugs, killing a man, lying to his family. Death was his way out, and now that is no longer able to be his crutch and his excuse. Walt punching the towel dispenser in the bathroom and seeing his warped reflection on it. It's the symbolism of the idea that he has to live with himself now, and he has to live with this distorted reflection of himself. He's changed, and it's a part that he can't go back on now that he has invested so much. And then, of course, we have to talk about Jesse and Jane. Jesse gets a new apartment after his parents kick him out of the house that he was looking after. His new landlord just so happens to be a smoking hot, dark-haired tattoo artist that any thinking man would want to try to get with. I understand. But Jane is trouble, fellas. But not at first. She's 18 months sober from heroin, and she does well at staying away from drugs, even though Jesse is doing some, and she's pretty confident he's a drug dealer. But when you're around the temptation long enough, eventually there is a breaking point. Like I said, this season does a very good job at showing the horrible repercussions of drugs and what actually happens to the people that are out there buying them. It's a downward slope for them both. Because of Jesse, Jane leans back into her habits, and because of Jane, she leads Jesse down an even more destructive path, introducing him to heroin. The scene it all builds towards is Walt coming back to Jesse's apartment, finding them both passed out on drugs, and while trying to wake Jesse up, Jane rolls over on her back and begins to vomit. But she can't move. In danger of choking to death, a very true and real-life consequence shown on the screen, Walt goes to move her to her side, but then stops himself. In a moment of contemplation, Walt sees an opportunity here. He sees Jane as somebody that is going to drag Jesse to an early grave, getting him hooked on this drug in particular, but also because of this, Jesse almost ruined their first meeting with Gus. Because when Walt was told by Saul to meet with the high-end businessman dealer at a fast food restaurant, Los Pollos Hermanos, Jesse shows up late, high, and Gus saw this, and he ignored them, refusing to do business with anybody that would compromise his business because of dealing with a drug addict. The next day, Walt is able to discern who Gus is, the actual owner of the restaurant, and Gus, vaguely but specifically, telling Walt that he wants nothing to do with him, mostly because of Jesse. But in one last-ditch effort, Gus allows Walt one chance to make a deal, to bring all of their meth at once to a location for a payment of $1.2 million. With that neat compromise of a deal of a lifetime, along with Jane blackmailing them for Jesse's cut before he got clean, Walt suspects Jane will be the end of it all. His only chance to save Jesse is for her to be out of the picture, and in this moment, he doesn't even need to do anything. But that's the thing. He does nothing. Maybe not murder, but not far from. Bryan Cranston, the actor, said that while doing this scene, he thought about his own daughter, which is what gives him such an honest reaction. Even if Jane is the problem, Jane is somebody's daughter. Even the character of Walt in the series just had his newborn girl before this moment happened. This could be anybody's daughter. It could be his daughter one day. But still, he holds back, and Jane dies. In the finale of the season, we are introduced to Mike for the first time, the man Saul sends to clean up the mess and tell Jesse what to do to avoid arrest. Apparently, this was actually supposed to be Saul himself, but the actor couldn't make it originally, so they wrote a brand new character. Enter Mike, which is just one of those amazing coincidences since Mike not only goes on to become a fan favorite in Breaking Bad, but he also becomes a main character in Better Call Saul. But anyway, I saved this final talking point for last because this is basically how the season ends, so it makes the most sense to talk about it here. We have to talk about Skylar for a bit. I said in my season 1 review, I think that she gets way too much hate, and the finale of season 2 is one of the prime reasons why, because she lays it all on the line here, and she makes a lot of sense. From her perspective, her husband is always disappearing, she knows he's lied to her, and is no doubt keeping something important from her. She suspected he had 2 phones, he denied it over and over, but then he outed himself when he was under the anesthesia. She spent, from the moment that he was diagnosed, to help him the best that she could. She tried to get him the best care, she tried to get him the best treatment, she was searching for him when he was missing, and all the while, there was this secret that she couldn't figure out. She finds out that when he left for 4 days to visit his mom, so he said, he didn't even go there, even though she dropped him off and picked him up at the airport. She is 100% in her right to call him out on all of this, and she's only acting how a normal person would act in this situation. And their relationship is about to get a whole lot rockier with the introduction of her old boss, Ted, the guy that took her to the hospital when she was giving birth and was there when her daughter was born, as opposed to Walt, who missed it because he was making a drug deal. The end of the season has her leaving Walt alone in the house, only to have the season opening teasers finally be revealed. Jane's father, who was an air traffic controlman, was too distraught over his daughter's death, a death that Walt could have prevented easily, and makes a mistake on the job, causing 2 planes to crash into one another, killing hundreds and raining debris and corpses all over Albuquerque. The butterfly effect comes full circle, and the consequences are shown. Overall, even though Season 2 doesn't hit the peaks that Seasons 3, 4, and 5 will, I think that it is filled with a lot of brilliant moments and a look at the fallout of what the lifestyle Walt has chosen to live gives him, along with making Walt have to deal with each of these decisions one by one as they all begin to crumble under his feet. Yes, he's made more money than he expected to, but what now? His family life is being destroyed in the process, and hundreds of people are beginning to be affected. Not to mention, there are rumblings about somebody being out for his head, and what would Gus Fring eventually want from Walt moving forward? And all that is explored later in Season 3. Sadly, I first started watching Breaking Bad when it was in its final season, but I could not imagine what it would have been like having to wait an entire week after the Half Measures cliffhanger. Honestly, has to be one of, hands down, the top 3 best cliffhangers at the end of an episode of all time. Overall, Season 3 has a couple of different story elements going on, but remains clear in its direction and gets more and more in-depth into the psychology of the characters. Walt begins in an incredible crossroad. He was paid his large sum of money for his entire product, he's no longer cooking, and he received surgery for his cancer. Things could potentially go well for him now, if not for the fact of the tirade of consequences from his actions of the first 2 seasons. A butterfly effect of bad events caused a massive plane collision above his town, in which he is adjacently responsible for, trying to ease his guilt of that entire process as the town mourns, and as Jesse sits in rehab each and every day, it's a constant reminder of Jane's death and his experiences. Skylar, his wife, has also decided to separate from him, calling him out for his lies, forcing Walt to move out of the house and even guessing correctly that he is somehow involved with drugs. Walt, dealing with trying to put his family back together, runs the gamut of being sympathetic and hilarious, the pizza on the roof scene, of course, but also being extremely disturbing because Skyler knows that he's involved with drugs, but refuses to tell their son because it would ruin his image of how he looks up to his father, Walt. So, as Walt essentially forces himself back into the house, which is technically his house also, so, there's a lot of different lines being crossed here, Skyler is terrified and unable to tell the truth because of their son, and in fact, still doesn't even know the whole truth. And I mentioned this before, but again, look, I don't think that Skyler is like an S-tier character or anything like that, but from her perspective of events, what she does and what she's experiencing is scary, and her reactions make sense. Yes, she does go and have sex with her boss Ted, and yes, she does do it to piss off Walt as a form of an attack, but she's trying to get Walt to leave her, to sign the divorce papers, to be done with this, but she can't do anything violent and she can't go to the cops, so hey, why not fuck your boss and hit him where it really hurts? Things get even worse when Jesse gets out of rehab. He's broken and distraught from Jane's death and feeling like he has nothing and nobody, and so he resorts to the only thing that he thinks he can do, well, cooking meth, though this time not partaking in any of it himself. And this time working without Walt, which causes even more friction. And I love the scene where Walt sees Jesse's product, and you can tell that he is furious because it's just as good as when they cooked together. This makes him feel inferior because to him, even though he has affection for Jesse, he views Jesse as the inferior one, somebody that would need his help in order to make it. And all those years of him being a student and not applying himself, once you make a strong impression of who a person is in your mind, it's really hard to break that vision when they change or when they progress in life. I think that's the theme of the series also, and also lends to why Hank never suspected Walt. He already had a version of Walt in his mind of a weak and docile man, so it's going to take something incredibly drastic in order to change that perception. There's also even more consequences coming into play with what I'm going to call the main antagonists of the first half of the season. These are the twins, the Salamanca cousins of Tuco that viciously make their way up past the border and into the States to try to find and kill the ones responsible for Tuco's death. Walt literally would have been hacked up to death with an axe in episode 2 if not for the intervention of Gus Fring. Gus becomes a lot more of a presence in this season. We get to see his entire underground super lab, capable of creating large batches of product daily, and his request for Walt to run it. Walter, the failed chemist who now gets to run his own laboratory, not to mention get paid about $1 million a month to do so. Not a bad deal. Between the money, his family's well-being, to stop Jesse from selling, and being that he's already this far in, the temptation eventually takes its course and Walt begins working for Gus full-time. I also really like Hank's journey this season. We've already seen how he keeps that jokingly bravado facade around his peers, but truly has a very difficult time dealing with his PTSD and past experiences. When they offer him to go back to Texas, the place where he watched a severed head on a turtle blow up, blowing a bunch of people into pieces, well, he tries to distract himself by throwing all of his efforts back into the Heisenberg blue meth case, an excuse to not have to face up to those types of experiences again, but sadly, one that leads him to even worse events. Tracking down RVs eventually lead him to Jesse, and after a quick lie to throw him off their trail long enough to dispose of the RV, Hank shows up at Jesse's doorstep and viciously beats him out of anger and frustration. As a result, Hank is suspended from the police force, and we get a lot of really intimate moments with him and Marie. And no, I'm not talking about that awkward hospital handjob. Yeah. Hank has to come to face with his own consequences, that there are both a desire to do the right thing within him, but also this need to prove his justification for staying in town for that specific case, which drove him to this. And I really like those moments between him and Marie when Hank gets kind of vulnerable. I kind of really enjoy seeing Hank within that position and see that there's a lot more to him than was originally shown back in season 1. But ultimately, two paths collide and the Salamanca twins come to exact vengeance on Hank, just as he was stripped of his badge and gun. Of course, It's all a ploy by Gustavo Fring to throw the twins off of Walt, start a feud that makes crossing the border even harder, and take territory away from the cartel, all at the expense of one single DEA agent, Hank. Though Hank is given a warning and is able to fight back, he does manage to incapacitate one of the twins and kill the other, but he is shot several times himself in the process, and keeping the show grounded within reality, this is a major issue to deal with. Hank is unable to walk for the entire rest of the season and well into season 4. His medical bills skyrocket and they're not sure how they're going to pay it, and he loses what leftover feelings of self-worth he once had. It's actually an incredibly tragic ending, and we don't really get any kind of solace for Hank the rest of the season. We leave with him being broken. But after that, things turn around for a little bit. Jesse gives a heart-wrenching speech to Walt in the hospital, probably one of Aaron Paul's best performances, leading Walt to replace his current assistant Gail with Jesse, effectively getting the two of them back together and working again. Skylar also starts to come around to Walt very slowly, once she sees just how much money he's making, thinking about how desperate he was when he thought he was going to die, and wanting to help Hank and Marie with their bills. Somehow Walt does manage to bring her into the fold, kind of. She eventually is more okay with him staying in the house, and she wants to help professionally launder their money, but she's kept at enough of a distance that it's more of a out of sight, out of mind, just don't get caught kind of thing. But it's also just another piece of Walt's corruption spreading to everybody around him. Season 3 also has probably the most controversial episode called The Fly. It's a bottle episode, which means an episode that takes place all in one location. It focuses on Walt trying to get a fly out of the lab, which he calls a contaminant, and Jesse eventually joins in. Now, I always consider this episode to be the perfect example to figure out if you are a plot or character person when it comes to stories that you enjoy. People that are invested mostly in plot hate this episode because truly the plot does not progress. It stays focused on Walt and Jesse having conversations with each other the entire episode. However, character people love this episode precisely for that reason. And look, neither is incorrect. You can enjoy stories however you want to. Some people want the plot and narrative to continuously progress because that's essentially what storytelling is. But people like myself are far more interested in what's going on within a character's head. I've said before, if you have great characters, you could give me an entire movie of them just sitting down eating dinner, and I would probably enjoy it. This episode focuses on Walt dealing with not just the events of the show so far, but the realization that he is stuck here essentially forever. He gave up his soul, and there's no going back from this point. The Fly is just a distraction from him dealing with the realities of his current situation. He talks about how he wished he had died. He wished that the cancer did kill him, and that Skylar never found out what he was doing, and that he can't believe how long this has gone on for and who he's actually become. It's a real introspective episode. And the fact that he almost confesses to Jesse about Jane. He keeps telling Jesse that he's sorry, and Jesse is like, it's fine, it's not your fault, it's not my fault. But Walt's apology is so true and sincere that you almost forget what a horrible person he can be at times. Ultimately, Fly is an episode that you're either going to love or you're going to hate, but I personally am on the side of loving it. Now, the final piece of this season brings back the plot point of Season 2 and Combo, one of Jesse's friends and sellers that was killed while dealing. Turns out that area was Gus's territory and he had a hand in it. The final 2 episodes are a roller coaster ride of anxiety. You have Jesse wanting to poison the 2 men responsible, Walt trying to talk him down and find a way to stop Jesse's involvement, and then we get one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, which is when Mike shows up to Walt's house and gives him the half-measure speech that the episode is titled after. We learn that Mike used to be a cop and how he would always give warnings to this domestic abuse call, how Mike wanted to just kill the guy. Ultimately, one time Mike stuck a gun in the guy's mouth and gave him that warning, that half measure, but after letting him go, he still wound up killing his spouse. Moral of the story being that half measures don't solve the problem. The way that Mike delivers the story is haunting, and I think it's one of his best character moments.
I chose a half measure when I should have gone all the way. I'll never make that mistake again.
When Jesse goes to kill the two men and Walt drives in to save his life, it is one of the only moments that the first time I watched it, I actually verbally screamed. I think I might have even stood up from the couch, which almost never happens. And the way Walt just runs over and shoots the second guy in the head, like, okay, I know these guys are drug runners and they had just murdered a child, so justified, sure, but it was still a shock to see Walt just so casually kill someone. He hadn't killed anybody hands-on since Crazy 8 in Season 1, and that took him an entire episode to build up the courage to do it. So it just shows how far Walt has changed within that time also. The last episode puts Walt and Jesse into a corner. Gus needs the lab to run, and without them, Gale, who was Walt's former assistant, would be the only person that could run it. So Walt sees no other solution but to kill Gale, forcing Gus to keep them alive. So it's a race to stay hidden, find where Gale is located, and then go there and pull the trigger. At first, Walt agrees to do it, but then Mike and Victor snatch him up and take him to the lab in order to get rid of him. And I love Walt's cries and pleas to make his phone call to Jesse. The acting is so real, and you really feel Walt's terror in this moment. And you also get that brilliant switch once he does make the call and tells Jesse to go kill Gale, because then he has them right where he wants them. Walt speaks with this confidence again, and he owns the room as Mike and Victor wonder just what the fuck just happened. But the moral quandary is Gale, and he's, for lack of a better word, innocent. Okay, yeah, he was cooking meth, but he's just a nerd. He wouldn't hurt anybody, he wouldn't wish poorly on Walt and Jesse, he didn't even plot any vengeance when he was replaced. He's just a guy. And now Jesse, who's never shot and killed anyone in his life, is forced to put a bullet into this pleading man's head as the gun fires and the season ends. I consider Season 3 to be where Breaking Bad really begins to shift into high gear. Actually, towards the end of Season 3 is where the show hits its halfway point, and you can feel that. It's like it was slowly climbing up a roller coaster, and when it reaches the halfway mark, we are now on our way down. Things get faster, more chaotic, scarier, and there's no turning back at this point. Season 4 of Breaking Bad has got to be one of the most intense and anxiety-inducing seasons of television I've ever seen. Picking up right where Season 3 left off, Jesse is now responsible for the murder of Gale, leaving nobody able to cook for Gus Fring except for Walt and Jesse themselves. The entire first episode has the two of them held within the lab itself by Mike and Victor, awaiting the arrival of Gus to dish out whatever punishment he sees fit. Upon his arrival, you have the two major differences at play between Walt and Jesse. Walt is consistently talking, trying to explain within as full of reason and logic as possible as to why Gus should keep them alive, desperately pleading, whereas Jesse, dealing with the act of just murdering somebody in cold blood, stays silent, awaiting whatever fate is to become of him without regard of his own life. Gus is also silent here, letting his body language and actions send the intended message, slicing Victor's throat right in front of them and making them watch this man's final gasp for life within the hands of Gus Fring. Walt may have won the battle and saved his life for the time being, but he is still within the grasp of Gus. And what good graces they may have had has now been sliced away. Gus killing Victor can be interpreted a multitude of ways. Victor was at the crime scene and probably could be recognized or leave prints, and he also took it upon himself to try to cook the meth, which is not his job. But ultimately, it can still be seen as a display of dominance, and though Gus can't kill them yet, they will know their place, that they belong to him. And thus starts the chess match of which this entire season becomes Walt versus Gus, and who will ultimately gain control. Walt is at a severe disadvantage this season, and a large theme that runs through it is Walt's desperate struggle to gain some semblance of control over the threat of imminent death, over Jesse's partnership, over his own life and his own choices. There is nothing worse for his ego than the realization this season that he has next to no moves that he can make. He's at the mercy of Gus, at the mercy of how far into the criminal world he's become, the mercy of needing to launder his money in some type of way, and losing those that he could once trust. In fact, Season 4 may be the most isolated that we see Walt throughout the whole series, minus the last 2 episodes of Season 5. and that makes him the underdog, which is where the vast amount of creativity comes to the writing of this season, because by season 4 we have spent nearly 40 episodes with Walter and watched him do some really bad things. But I think no more than season 4 does the show really make you root for him. And considering what he does in season 4 is worse than seasons 1 through 3, that says a lot about how compelling you can make the protagonist in this series. We've seen how hard Walt has worked, the sacrifices he made, and the lies upon lies that he's told to get to this point. It's like, finally he's making a lot of money. Finally he has a way to secure his income. Finally he's back with his wife and kids. But we are really rooting for a man that's willing to poison a child in order to manipulate an emotionally destroyed young man into obeying him. A man that is willing to bomb a nursing home, a man that is willing to drive his brother-in-law into oncoming traffic to avoid suspicion. Yeah, we are.
Don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
And honestly, it works great for the overall narrative. Season 4 is where we make Walt the ultimate underdog climbing his way to dominance, which will lead into Season 5 when we see how terrifying Walt at the top of his power can truly be. For Jesse Pinkman, he is caught at a major crossroads, and I think what they do with Jesse this season might be my favorite storyline for him. After having to kill Gale, Jesse is unable to deal with the silence. He has massive parties at his house to drown out his own intrusive thoughts and the horrific images of the shooting. All the while, Walt seems to have no sympathy for making Jesse do what he did. He is so concerned for his own well-being that he treats this traumatic event like it's nothing. Meanwhile, Gus makes a play to course-correct Jesse's priorities, slowly separating him from Walt. Pairing up Jesse with Mike, that was a fantastic idea. You could not get two characters that are more different, and I love getting character interactions that you wouldn't normally think of. Mike is so down to business, efficient, and experienced, and Jesse is so unsure of himself that the dynamic just works great. And I love this sort of bond that they get and how Mike sort of becomes this other adult figure in Jesse's life other than Walt, that he's, constantly thinking about which one that he should go with at any given time. In a roundabout way, they form a pretty tight bond, and Jesse even gets to meet Gus a few times after growing closer to the inner circle while Walt is being pushed more away. Not to mention, while all this is going on between the characters, the plot is pressing forward with the idea that the Mexican cartel is coming down hard on Gus, taking down his shipments of meth and forcing him into a deal with them. This leads to great character discoveries within Gus Fring and his history and connection with the cartel. We learn about his backstory, meeting with Don Eladio, basically the top dog of the cartel, and how Gus and his partner, the other half of the Pollos Hermanos, wanted to partner up with the cartel and sell meth. His partner being the one that knew how to cook it, and having him shot and killed right in front of Gus. One of the only times that we see Gus both enraged to the point that he's willing to attack, and also broken to the point where he's crying his eyes out at the sight of his deceased partner. And we understand why Gus is so adamant about his plan, why he needed to have it happen, why he had the lab built, and that his motivation has always been revenge. To gain the power and distribution, as well as to take out the cartel, take out Eladio, and all of the Salamancas, including the man who pulled the trigger on his partner, Hector, Mr. Bellringer himself. It all comes full circle as Gus makes his play to go to Mexico, kill them all, and come back to rub it in Hector's face, enjoying his victory and the fact that Hector is helpless to do anything against him. Now, as far as Hank's story this season, it's a rough one for him. He's still unable to walk after being shot, and he pretty much stays this way all season. At first, he's distracting himself by collecting these rocks, or minerals, I guess. Also, he is such an asshole to Marie in the beginning of the season. It honestly drives me crazy. Marie is so loving and supportive and by his side, and I don't think many women would be willing to put up with as much as she has, and honestly, she really cares for him, so that part really always irritated me. But soon after, Hank begins to help out with the death of Gale case and stumbles upon a clue that leads him to suspect Gus may be involved. But of course, if not for Walt's ego and suggesting that Gale probably wasn't the real Heisenberg, Hank might have never decided to look into the case any deeper. But it was that spark that gets Hank out of his funk and back onto the case. The best part is that Hank has Walt drive him around to stake out all of Gus's locations, while Walt has to play along and try to convince Gus from afar that he's trying to calm Hank's suspicions down. And let's not forget about Skylar this season. Now, once again, I am not a Skylar hater, and the plan to con Bogdan out of his car wash was a ton of fun to watch. I loved that. It was a great idea, giving them the excuse that they need to launder all of Walt's cash. And the one thing I love in storytelling is how sometimes seemingly disconnected plot threads can link up perfectly. See, Ted, Skylar's former boss and the one that she had an affair with, he owes an insane amount of money to the IRS, and if they decide to audit him, Skylar knows that they may audit her as well since she did the bookkeeping for him. So she tries to give Ted money that he needs, taking it out of their fund, using Saul to fabricate a dead relative inheritance for Ted. But though Ted accepts the money, he refuses to pay what he owes right away. Skylar keeps trying to make it happen to the point of sending Huel and QB over to Ted's place to intimidate him, and Ted winds up, yeah. But it links up perfectly to when Gus decides to replace Walt with Jesse permanently, and threatens to kill Walt's family if he interferes with getting rid of Hank in order to prevent the ongoing investigation. Walt decides that he has no choice but to take the last resort and use all of his money to get his family out of town, get them new identities and a brand new life. But with half of his earnings gone to Ted, he can't. The ending of the episode Crawl Space has Walt falling into a full mental breakdown, unable to escape his fate, knowing that Gus plans to kill Hank, knowing Jesse is against him, and with no money coming in anymore, everything is about to be gone. The last 2 episodes of Season 4 is an insane back and forth of power plays between Walt and Gus. I love how we as the audience are kept guessing. The first time watching this, I had no idea how it was going to turn out. Did Walt poison the kid, or was it Gus? Or was it neither? Walt making this little old lady go into his house while he watches from afar to see if there was assassins in there trying to kill him, and there was. Ultimately, it culminates with Walt getting Jesse back on his side and even teaming up with Hector Salamanca in order to bring Gus down. By the way, I love the scene where they call Hank in to see Hector because he has some special message he'll only give Hank directly, and he just makes them spell out, "suck my dick." I laugh at that every time. But the ploy works. Walt gets Gus to visit Hector one last time so that he'll finish the job, and just as Gus is about to kill Hector, Hector finally looks him in the eye and uses Walt's bomb to blow them both the fuck up. And even though the final episode of this season will always be enjoyable, I wish I could watch it for the first time again. There is nothing like seeing Gus walk out of that room, wondering if this is going to keep going on, and then seeing that blown off piece of his face and thinking, holy shit, Walt actually did it. And that's the thing. This season is so good at making you root for Walt, and even seeing Gus's backstory and his struggle, neither him or Walt are really in the right. It was just a struggle for power, and for Walt,
I won.
Season 4 is many people's favorite, and it makes sense as to why. The episodes get more intense, there's more on the line than ever before, and it builds to a near-perfect finale. It also primes Walt up to be the devil incarnate that he becomes in Season 5, especially with the final shot of the season, zooming in on the Lily of the Valley, showing that everything between Walt and Jesse has been a manipulation, and that the darkest times are yet to come. Season 5 of Breaking Bad is perhaps one of the most addicting seasons of any show I've ever watched. Each episode seems to go by so quickly, being incredibly engaging, and all ending on cliffhangers that make you scream what the actual hell is going to happen next. Though technically Season 5 of Breaking Bad, the final season, is 16 episodes long, which is the longest season of all of them, however, it was split into 2 parts that aired nearly a year apart from one another, so in a way, you could say there is a Season 5 and a Season 6. Maybe this is where Attack on Titan got its idea to do multiple final seasons, although they managed to make it to having 3 final seasons and Breaking Bad only has 2. But unlike Attack on Titan, the season being split in half with 8 episodes apiece actually makes a lot of sense, because where the split happens, it kind of leads into 2 different storylines. There is a definitive first and second part of the story being told that sort of resolves itself after the first 8 episodes and then moves into the final 8. But this first segment I'm going to call the rise of Heisenberg, because that's essentially what we see happen. Walter White in this season, accumulating all the past trauma, pain, and events that he's gone through so far, ramps up his decisiveness, his selfishness, and above all, his capacity for darkness, continuing to justify everything so that he can resume walking down this path that he set out on, and it becomes an unstoppable addiction. The irony that this entire time he's been making a highly addictive chemical substance that destroys people's lives, and he himself, just like he talked about in the very first episode, growth, decay, and transformation, he has become an addict himself. An addict of getting away with it, of outsmarting other people, and making everything work out the way that he desires. With Gus Fring now dead and his operation dismantled, Walt is nowhere near done with trying to make a profit from his business and basically makes the moves to create his own meth empire. The location of where he and Saul get in touch with a pest control business which is run by a bunch of shady characters, and they literally start using fumigated houses as their lab, which is super messed up if you think about it, because imagine somebody coming into your home and just setting up a meth lab for a night or two. And the casualness of Walt doing this too, and without a second thought, is kind of scary to think about. Still, using and manipulating Jesse as his partner as well during this season, their relationship is obviously the best one in the show, but Walt seems to only appreciate Jesse when Jesse is doing something that Walt thinks he should be doing. It's a father knows best kind of mentality, but to an absolute sickening degree. I always felt like Walt believes Jesse owes everything to him somehow, and to a degree that can be true, but it hasn't gotten Jesse anywhere, except far deeper into criminality than he ever expected to. With Walt's willingness to poison a child to get Jesse back on his side and his lack of remorse about it, letting Jesse break down into tears thinking that he lost the rice and cigarette, and Walt comforting him as if he truly had. It's just so disgusting to see this man break down and pour his heart out to Walt, and Walt knowing the entire time that he's the reason why he's doing that. But Jesse, like everybody else, seems to be just a means to an end to him. Now, I do believe that Walt does love and care for Jesse in his own way, but that affection is only on display when Jesse is doing something that Walt wants him to be doing. Anytime Jesse branches out on his own, that love turns to bitter resentment at the flip of a switch. Now, I really need to talk about Mike here, because Mike is one of the best characters in the entire Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul universe, and I love his straight-to-the-point, take-no-bullshit style attitude. So when it comes to Walt, who just killed Mike's boss and blew up their entire operation, it makes sense that Mike would just want to kill him. I love every interaction with Walt and Mike this season. They argue constantly, Walt always thinking that he can handle and manipulate Mike. And then you have Mike, who is just stuck in this horrible position that he needs to solve. The cop sees all of his money that he had locked away for his granddaughter, and he's left with nothing. That and all of his men that were arrested, and he has to keep paying them for their silence, which forces Mike to have to team up with Walt on the new meth business, which creates a bunch of great interactions. Mike calling Walt a time bomb, just waiting for the moment that he explodes, suggesting to Jesse to just stop listening to him. Mike is right pretty much about virtually everything when it comes to Walt, and he always has been. He has that calm rationale and experience on both sides of the law that allow him to see things as they truly are, opposed to Walt's idealization of becoming the next Gus Fring, and everything that would entail. Skylar this season is where everybody starts to really despise her, but again, imagine knowing that your husband bombed a nursing home and has actively killed people and comes home and acts like it's nothing. At this point, she's been helping him with his operation and laundering his money, so she's in too deep to leave without being accountable herself. But every moment, Walt becomes more unpredictable and more dangerous, and she has a baby in the house, for God's sakes. A house that literally had assassins in it not too long ago that were looking for Walt. Her desire to want to get the kids out of the house, it makes sense, and when Walt basically says to her, "What are you gonna do? You can't go to the cops, and you can't keep me out of the house," it's legitimately terrifying. On Hank's end this season, he doesn't have a lot of great scenes in the first half. He does get promoted to ASAC, which is cool, and he gets some scenes with Mike interviewing and investigating him from being employed under Gus. And I love having scenes where characters that don't normally interact with one another are actually able to be in a scene, and also their personalities, the way that they clash, it's fantastic. Mike's calm, stoic superiority vibe and Hank continuously trying to get a rise out of him to no avail. It's fantastic. I think one of my favorite episodes of Breaking Bad is called Dead Freight. It's literally a train heist episode. How cool is that? There's a new character introduced named Lydia who works for a company that supplied the various chemicals for Gus's operation, including all of the methylamine. Well, under investigation, she can't get them anymore, but she does tell them about a train that's carrying gallons of it. And this whole episode is about how they're going to orchestrate this really cool way of stealing it by getting the train to stop, distracting the conductors, emptying the methylamine tank while simultaneously filling it back up with water so it seems like nothing happened. It's so intense, it's crazy, it's filmed very frenetically, it's one of my favorite moments, and there's this constant threat of being caught or not finishing in time. And then it ends on such a victory with the characters actually pulling it off, but then one random witness, a kid on a dirt bike, that another new character, Todd, just shoots and kills in cold blood, ending the episode on one of the biggest WTF moments of the entire series. Yeah, so Todd is a silent, seemingly very polite employee of the house fumigation crew who is also connected to a bunch of neo-Nazi criminals. And he has no qualms whatsoever with child murder. But this half of the season doesn't focus on him as much as it does with Walt's reaction to the situation, which is kind of just passive. And it's interesting to see him reach this place. Now, he's not condoning it, but he's also not letting a consequence like this interfere with his operation. Jesse is torn up about it. An innocent, a child, died because of them for no reason at all. And this wasn't a drug kingpin like Gus or some street slingers. This was just a kid. And Walt continuing to cook business as usual, whistling while he works, with that out of sight, out of mind mindset, it clashes with Jesse way too much. Another progression is when Mike finds a buyer that's willing to pay all three of them $5 million apiece for the methylamine that they stole. That's $5 million guaranteed and a way out of the business. More money than Walt ever expected to make when he started, and a perfect opportunity to give it all up and just live the rest of his life as a mild-mannered car wash owner, slowly laundering all the money that he's made over the years. But we're brought back to his original motivation and the regret and anguish that he felt towards Gretchen and Elliot. Those two characters have not been mentioned in a very long time at this point, but Walt brings up their company to Jesse, explaining to him and telling him how he took a buyout to the company that went on to make billions. Money that Walt felt entitled to, as if he should have been the one to become successful. And so this whole thing becomes more clear to Jesse. The addiction makes more sense, the desperate need to cling on to it and to push it as far as it can go. Self-admittedly, he is not here just to make enough to provide for his family and to gain them security. He is in the business of building an empire. Also, this scene leads into a very hilarious dinner with Walt, Skyler, and Jesse. Again, one of those great moments with characters that almost never interact, and just the second-hand awkwardness of the scene is fantastic. Now, one of the most tragic things in this season is Mike's untimely death. This hits even harder after watching Better Call Saul this year because you see how hard Mike has worked, the sacrifices that he made, and how he was correct this entire time. The DEA takes away his money twice, and he's left with no choice but to leave town. But Walt wants the names of the men in prison, of which Mike refuses to give. And as Walt tries to shake him down, Mike wonderfully tells him off and succinctly breaks down Walt's entire persona.
You could have shut your mouth, cooked, and made as much money as you ever needed. You just had to blow it up. You and your pride and your ego. You just had to be the man. If you'd done your job, known your place, we'd all be fine right now.
And then out of pure rage and frustration, Walt shoots Mike in the gut. And it's so completely out of pocket and unnecessary. First of all, this is the same man that took an entire episode to build up the courage to kill somebody back in season 1, and now he's willing to pull the trigger without even a second thought just because he's pissed off. Not only that, but it was all pointless because Walt knew that Lydia could also get him the names of the people in prison. And as Mike sits there bleeding out, nobody to comfort him, after everything that he's gone through, after his granddaughter is just going to think that he up and abandoned her at the park with no explanation, never to see him again, the only person he has to look at in his final moment is Walter White's stupid face. And I remember being so mad when I first saw this episode. I never thought Mike was going to make it out of the series alive, but to die so pointlessly for no reason at all, it just broke me for days, and I'm still not over it. The final episode of Part 1 exemplifies Walt's greed and power even more, expanding the reach of his distribution, incorporating Todd to take Jesse's spot, and instead of paying for the silence of Gus's employees in prison, Walt uses Todd's connections to perform a hit within the prison walls themselves, killing all 9 men within minutes of one another so that none of them can speak. And this wasn't a mercy killing. This wasn't even anybody that Walt knew. This was purely all to protect his innocence in the eyes of the law, and it works. Now, the dynamic between Walt and Jesse ends in a very strange place in Part 1. Jesse walks out on the business, and Walt refused to pay him the $5 million that he was owed. But after a few months and Walt's empire reaches the highs that he never thought imaginable, Skyler showing him the mountain of money that he has acquired, only then does Walt decide maybe he should reconcile with Jesse again and give him what he's owed. They have a very awkward conversation and a moment of nostalgia talking about the RV, but when Walt leaves, you get the sense that part of Jesse thought maybe Walt was there to kill him too, so that he would never talk. And Jesse's uncertainty and inability to trust is apparent here. And whereas Jesse seems to have no idea what to do next with his life, Walt finally tells Skyler that he's made enough and he's willing to walk away. And then we have what could possibly be an ending. Walt was never caught. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been collected. Him and Skyler are not doing well, but she's still here. And the only thing that could ruin this is one thing, and that is a simple, honest-to-God misstep in which nobody could have predicted. The same book of poems that Gale had, he had also gifted to Walt, with a little bit of writing inside saying nearly the same quote from his personal collection. Did Walt even realize that that quote was there? Did he even remember? The book sat casually in his bathroom underneath a stack of magazines, and when Hank goes in to drop the biggest log this side of the border, he needs something to read while it's going on. And he just so happens to pick up the book. Everything Walt did to be so careful, all the murders, the silencing, the chaos, the lies and maneuvers, all of it about to be undone by one simple phrase written in a book that he never expected anybody to ever pick up. I love it. And it was here that I caught up with Breaking Bad for the first time, and waiting almost an entire year after this cliffhanger was excruciating. But that's where Part 1 ends. After all this time of Hank hunting down Heisenberg and unknowingly breaking bread with him on a near-weekly basis, it's about time. The final 8 episodes of Breaking Bad deliver on every conceivable level, but most of all, on a promise that was teased dangling in front of our faces ever since the very beginning of the series, and that is the moment and the repercussions of what happens when Hank finds out that Walt is actually the Heisenberg he's been looking for all along. And from that moment, watching this show is like being at the peak of a mountain and shooting down as fast as possible, unable to stop the oncoming crash. In the very first episode, Hank does everything that he can to try to believe that this information isn't true. In a nice little recap of all the previous season, Hank shifts through all of the mountains of evidence and events that had happened along the way, locking himself away in his garage, trying to come to terms with what he has just discovered. The problem, though, is that he doesn't have any hard evidence other than the book of poems with Gale's handwriting in it, but that's not really enough for a conviction. As well, he has reservations telling the DEA as to not look like a fool, having a literal drug runner under his nose for nearly 2 years. And more than that, it's also this sense of betrayal. Walt was somebody that he could rely on. He had family dinners, stakeouts, uplifting talks between the two of them. Imagine being that close with somebody and then finding out they're a completely different person behind the scenes. When Walt confronts Hank at the end of the first episode, it is incredibly satisfying, on one hand, to see this finally come out in the open, but also heartbreaking as of what it's going to mean moving forward. Walt is also thrown into this unique position where, of course, he doesn't come out and tell the truth, but also as Hank represents not just the opposite side of the law, but somebody who has always been the more masculine force in their family dynamic, somebody that Walt's son has looked up to more than him on more than one occasion. Walt takes this moment to turn to his Heisenberg persona, basically threatening Hank in the subtlest of ways, and the delivery of this line gives me chills every time that I hear it.
If you don't know who I am, then maybe your best course would be to tread lightly.
And, as much as Hank has some serious character flaws, and has always let his own pride and insecurities cause him to make bad decisions at times, at the end of the day, he has been one of the few characters that has attempted to do the right thing after he screws up. Finding out about Walt, he assumes that Skylar has been manipulated, and he tries to give her a chance to clear her name and talk to him, even when she refuses. And from her perspective, it comes from a place of self-preservation and a preservation of her children, because at this point, the only character that doesn't know is Walter Jr., and not knowing, he's the only one that still has the same respect and love for his dad as he had from the start. They have a couple emotional moments together with Junior's concern, and it makes the ultimate moment that much more painful when Junior finally finds out. But before we talk about that, I need to get into Jesse this season. Another constant victim of manipulation by the hands of Walter White, Jesse has his $5 million but is unresponsive to it. Scared at the realization that Walt must have killed Mike and lied to him about it, Jesse decides he doesn't want the money at all. He wants to give half of it to Mike's granddaughter and the other half to the family of the boy that was shot during the train heist, but he's unable to do so. So he just decides to throw it all out, showing one of the many differences of Jesse and Walt. And look, I don't see Jesse as a pure, innocent soul that was only corrupted by Walt. Jesse has made a lot of horrible choices on his own, but after everything that they experienced, Walt gained this sense of fulfillment, whereas Jesse has just become more and more of a broken man. Rather throw all of his money away than be reminded of the process it took to get it. But we do finally have Jesse figure out on his own that Walt was the one that switched the rice and cigarette, making him think that Gus was the one that poisoned Brock. And this pushes Jesse past the point of no return. He had one chance to leave town, gain a new identity, but he gave it up to rush back to Saul's office, assaults him, sticks a gun in his face, and makes him admit that Walt switched the cigarette. Attempting to take full revenge into his own hands, Jesse actually attempts to burn down Walter's house in one of the craziest cliffhangers of the entire show. And I do feel deep sadness for Jesse here. He has done so much for Walt, but mostly it's because of being tricked or pushed or pressured into it. And yeah, Gus Fring was a drug kingpin and not what we could say is a good person, but Jesse actually had a good thing going with him, if you think about it, before Walt destroyed it all. But destroying it by being willing to poison a child that Jesse loved and cared for. And as Jesse said, Walt does it just as a move, just as a tactic. And it leads to one of the craziest team-ups of the whole series, which is Jesse and Hank. If you would have told me at some point during the first few seasons that Jesse and Hank would be working together to take down Walt, it would seem like the most unlikely pairing you could possibly get, but that's what makes it so great. They actually work very well together, and Jesse admits everything to him, all of Walt's darkest secrets on the table, and it's just a matter of the best way to take him down. Now, I may have a very controversial take here, but Jesse should have just done what Hank wanted him to do, because he was supposed to wear a wire and get Walt to confess, which Walt would have done because the thought of Jesse working with the DEA, let alone Hank, is not something Walt in a million years would suspect. but Jesse chooses to abort the mission in an attempt to have Walt lead them to his buried money. And this setup leads to absolute disaster. I know it's only in hindsight that this is a mistake, and Jesse thought Walt was going to assassinate him, so I get it. But because Jesse changes the plan, Walt actually does hire assassins, and not just assassins, but the entire group of Nazis that the psychopath Todd is a part of. And everything goes to hell from here. The true climax of Breaking Bad are the 2 episodes to Tajali and Ozymandias. We return to the site of Walt and Jesse's very first cook. Walt buried the money here and he believes that Jesse is burning it, but when Walt arrives, all he has done has led Hank, Jesse, and Gomez right to him. And it's over. Walt has nowhere to run. This is pretty much him at his most vulnerable. He's not going to shoot at Hank, and he has to come out and face the music. What we can say for Hank is that he did, indeed, at the end of the series, finally catch Heisenberg. He's able to put the cuffs on him, read him his rights, but he's just not ever able to take him to jail. The episode Ozymandias is, without a doubt, the best episode of the series, and single-handedly the greatest hour of television I have ever seen. It pays off on so many different story elements of the series, and also truly cements itself as the fall of everything. Every single consequence that you could imagine all barrels down one after the other. The Nazis show up, they shoot down Gomez and Hank. Walt begs them to spare Hank's life, even offering up all of his money to do so. Instead, they just decide to take his money and kill Hank anyway. But Hank does go out like an absolute badass, I gotta say, and I respect the way that it was done. I really love that his character and how much nuance that they were able to bring to him and add to the stereotypical trope of the man that acts like everything's a joke, but really deals with a lot of intense trauma, PTSD, his own insecurities, and etc. But in the very end, Hank went down standing toe-to-toe with his enemy and never begging for his life. But that is only the first 5 minutes of that episode. After that, Walt's money is taken, minus 1 barrel that the very generous Nazis allow him to have. Walt then hands Jesse over to them to kill, but they decide to use Jesse for meth production instead. As they take him away, Walt stops them, and you think maybe it's to say, don't kill him, or maybe ask to spare him, but no. Walt looks him dead in the eye and tells him the truth about Jane, that he watched her die and willingly chose not to save her. A secret that he'd been holding on to since season 2, and he tells it to him in the coldest way possible. It broke me, man.
I watched Jane die. I watched her overdose and choke to death. I could have saved her. But I didn't.
And it doesn't end there. At this point, Walt has no options. He needs to escape before the police actually arrest him, and as Marie is forcing Skyler to tell Walt Jr. the truth, Walt returns home and tries to pack everything up as soon as possible. But when Skyler and Jr. get there, this to me is one of the hardest scenes to watch. The acting is beautiful, realistic, the desperation in Walt's voice, the confusion on Jr., and Skyler's realization that Hank would have never let Walt go. So if he is here, then Hank must be dead. Walt is panicked. He can't say anything in front of his son. He's just yelling at them to pack, that he'll explain later. And the moment when Skyler picks up the knife telling him to leave, and then this horribly heartbreaking moment of her and Walt struggling and fighting over the knife. This scene is done with just sound effects, no music, and it's so viscerally real. The domestic abuse aspect of it just makes me want to cry. It's crazy. This household has turned into this madness. And I love that it's Walter Jr. that comes to his mom's aid, ripping Walt off of her and then calling the cops on him. Jr., who has always been Team Walt, immediately shifts the moment that his mom is in danger. He doesn't get to do a whole lot of stuff during the series. I mean, Jr. isn't innocent here. He's just a regular teenager. But I love that when this moment happens, he just shifts into the protector and just immediately turns on Walt. But then Walt runs out of the house with the baby, smashing into Skyler's car, her chasing him down the street. It's just, I don't even have the words to describe it. The emotional roller coaster is almost too hard to bear, and then you realize there's still 2 episodes left after this. But yes, emotions are high, and Walt is a bastard, but he does ultimately still love his family. He does the only thing that he could think of, and he leaves Holly at the fire station to be returned to Skyler, and also calls Skyler to basically pretend that he never told her any of the details about his operation and forced her to launder his money. It's a brilliant scene, with Walt's voice and words that are saying one thing, but the emotion on his face saying the complete opposite. The final 2 episodes really feel like an epilogue. Walt has to connect with the man that will give him a new identity, taking him up to the snowy outskirts of New Hampshire to live off-grid in a small cabin, far away from any connections or any possibility to get help. Meanwhile, Jesse is being kept as a pet for Todd and forced to cook meth tied to a tether. And bro, when Jesse attempts to escape and then Todd goes to Andrea's and just shoots her in the head, holy crap, this scene makes me so mad. If you didn't hate Todd yet, I don't know how you don't in this scene. She had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. She is a complete innocent, and Jesse's reaction is so terrifying. After months go by, Walt tries to connect with his son over the phone, but Junior shoots him down and just wishes he would die. Followed by that, Walt seeing the TV segment of his old friends Elliot and Gretchen, and then commenting on whoever Walt is now, it's not the man that they knew, which leads into the final episode. And I don't necessarily see this episode as a redemption story for Walt, though I can see how some would view it at that, but I think he's past that point. His son hates him, his daughter will never know who he is, he can't let everything be for nothing, and the only thing that he can do is try to get his money to his family somehow, and also get revenge for Hank's death. And these things are what he sets out to do, no longer caring if he lives or dies, or can ever be with his family again. It's tying up loose ends. I don't think Walt cares anymore about trying to be seen as this positive, providing figure for his family. At this point, he just wants it done. Because his family will never know that the money came from him. He essentially breaks into Gretchen and Elliot's house and tells them to take all of his money and put it into a trust fund for Junior's 18th birthday, a gift from a couple that are already millionaires and who are known for helping those affected by drugs, so it wouldn't seem that strange. Also, they already have a connection with Walt's family. They agree, but of course, the extra incentive is Walt telling them that he paid assassins to watch over them, and if this is not done, they will die. And perhaps one of the only bits of levity in the final few episodes, the laser scopes are not from assassins, but actually just regular laser pointers from Badger and Skinny Pete. And I love that they get a nice little moment. We get to see him one last time, and it's great that the threat was all a facade. Walt also briefly sees Skylar, giving her the location of Hank and Gomez's bodies to give to the police, also finally admitting to her that it was for his own sake that he did what he did. He enjoyed the thrill, the victories, getting away with it, and believed himself to be good at what he did. Walt had many opportunities to quit, going all the way back to season 1, but this world of crime allowed Walt to embrace his true self, and to live a life where he felt some semblance of control over it. But by burning so bright, he was destined to burn out quick. The ride is over, and he gets nothing in return. Learning that Jesse is alive and cooking, Walt not only plans to kill Jack and his crew, but also Jesse as well, attaching a spring-loaded M60 machine gun to the trunk of his car, and the climax of the episode is so satisfying. Again, Walt is paying the price. He's not making it out of this episode alive, but even more than him, we want to see Jack and his crew get what's coming to them. But when Walt arrives on the scene and sees that Jesse isn't working with them, but instead is a beaten and broken slave, their entire complicated relationship comes full circle. So much lying and betrayal between them, the turmoil, but when Walt looks at Jesse, he's taken aback to the idea that he sees him kind of like a son, and he can't let him die. Walt tackles him to get him out of the line of fire, presses the key fob to open the trunk, and the entire band of Nazis is mowed down. All but Todd, who Jesse gets the satisfaction of strangling to death. And Jack, unlike Hank, pleads with Walt to keep him alive so he can tell him where the money is. But just like Hank, Walt shoots him in the face mid-sentence in probably the most satisfying single gunshot in the entire series.
You want your money, right? Huh? You wanna know where it is? You pull that trigger, you never do.
Also, after being talked about since season 2, the ricin poison is finally used on Lydia, the distributor of the methylamine. Walt and Jesse give one final look to one another as Jesse steals one of the cars and makes a break for it. Walt, on the other hand, hit with a ricochet bullet, decides to stay here and face the music at last, giving one final look at the cooking lab, reminiscing on his experiences, and the perfect product that he had made, dying on his own terms. Told in the beginning that he was helpless and that cancer would kill him, he found his own agency and turned himself into a monster. Again, I don't see this as a redemption, but rather an acceptance. Walt knew what he was in the end. The admission to Skylar, staying away from Junior, threatening Gretchen and Elliot, and then murdering a whole bunch of people, Nazis or not. Walt's final fall was not as Walter White. Just like Gretchen said, Walter White was gone. In his last day on Earth, in his final moments of life, Walt died as Heisenberg and embraced and accepted that fact. This was actually my first time revisiting El Camino since it originally released in 2019. El Camino is a Netflix film written and directed by Vince Gilligan that basically serves as an epilogue for the Breaking Bad series. But more specifically, it's a finale for Jesse Pinkman. As fantastic as the final episode of Breaking Bad was, and honestly, I don't think there needed to be any more to it than there was, but the one character that didn't quite get enough time was Jesse. He spends pretty much the entire final episode still locked up and as a slave for the Nazis until he gets a moment of redemption when Walter White arrives. He gets to kill his abuser and ride away in one of the cars. But as he rides out of the compound, his future is unknown. But it's not like he can just go home. Everyone knows about his criminal activities and his connection to Walter White, and so El Camino serves as the vehicle. No pun intended. I'm sorry.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
To explain what happens to Jesse Pinkman. And after rewatching this, I will say there are some things that I truly love about this movie, but also some things I wish were done a little differently. Ultimately, though, I think the same cast and crew of the original series all came back 6 years later after its original ending, and because of that, it does feel like Breaking Bad, which is a good thing. And it definitely wouldn't have worked just tacked on to the end of the series, but it also does kind of feel like 2 or 3 episodes stitched together, just playing itself out. The premise is as simple as it can get in this world. Jesse needs to get the hell out of Albuquerque, and he begins with absolutely nothing. No money, no weapons, and the entire police force is out looking for him. And as Jesse searches for some solace and a way out, meeting back up with characters from the show, he also reflects on his past, all the choices he had made the last few years since joining up with Walter White, and how he is haunted by so many bad memories and the PTSD from them. I love how the first place that he decides to go is Skinny Pete's house, which we've never seen before. Badger and Skinny Pete are some of my favorite supporting characters, and it's just great to get a chance to see them again, and I love how they still live in a world kind of like Season 1 Jesse. And as Jesse has gone through so much compared to them, it's interesting to see their dynamic, and yet they still remain good friends. It's a really sweet moment when Skinny Pete vouches to cover for Jesse, keeps the stolen car, and then lets Jesse leave with one of theirs. He also gives Jesse his beanie, which is kind of like the signature item of his character, and he also calls Jesse his hero, and that is such a great moment. I love how it just adds more characterization to somebody like Skinny Pete, and it also is just so wholesome. I don't know, it's probably my favorite scene in the entire movie, honestly.
Why are you doing all this? Dude, you're my hero and shit.
From there, Jesse decides that he needs to get a shitload of cash so that he can see the man that makes people disappear and set him up with a new identity. This leads him going to one of Todd's apartments where he knows that money is stashed somewhere, just is unable to find it for some time, having been here before forcibly by Todd himself. Now, the flashback where Todd takes the imprisoned Jesse with him to dispose of a body, as a scene, I like it. Jesse has no choice, and the creepiness of how friendly Todd is to him and how he treats Jesse like a pet is just so off-putting that it makes you want to crawl right out of your skin. But I also do think the scene itself goes on a little too long, but I'll get to my gripes later on in the video. Another scene that I do love, though, is when Jesse meets up with the vacuum guy, the guy that gave Saul and Walt their new identities. I feel like this scene is pretty much everything we love about Jesse all the way from season 1 till now, because he obviously has matured quite a bit and he's hardened over time, so he's got a lot of confidence with what he's doing, but he's also got that slightly bumbling nature where he's trying to count up all of his money and putting every little dollar bill he can find from his pockets on the table. It's kind of a scene that I think encapsulates everything that is Jesse. And when the vacuum guy calls the police and then Jesse thinks that he didn't really do it, tries to get one up on him and then just realizes he did, it's just great.
Next time you try to pull this shit on someone, you don't just hang up on a 911 call.
Wow, you love that response time.
But ultimately, the vacuum guy has a business to run, and Jesse needs $1,800 more in order to get his new identity, which leads him to the man that built his entrapment in the meth lab for the Nazi characters. Now, this guy is not somebody we actually saw in the series, but the movie needed an antagonist and a way to give us a bit of action at the end, so we have this guy named Neil. And don't expect Neil to be the next Todd or Gus Fring, not by a long shot. But Neil also came for Todd's lost cash and reluctantly split it with Jesse. But as Jesse comes by to ask him for $1,800 more, he's not so generous to give it away. Again, though, I think that this scene shows the development and maturity of Jesse at this point. He's brave, he's already gone through so much, and he walks right up to them to ask for the money. And he thought about the escalation ahead of time. First he asks, but he also shows the gun to maybe sway them, but he also hides a second weapon in his pocket, allowing him to fire it in a hidden way if they attacked suddenly. And it hurts to see Jesse have to kill again, but given their history, it's at least justifiable enough, especially when Neil was going to attack him first. But this movie isn't really about antagonists or finding a new Gus Fring type character. This movie is about Jesse, and this gives Jesse one more foe to face down, one more remnant of his past to deal with, but it's not really meant to be anything beyond that. Now, at the end of the movie, Jesse requests to be taken to Alaska and kind of drives off into the distance to start his new life, which is great to see him get away, and unlike Walter White or Saul, he won't be coming back or delving into his old ways where he winds up. And overall, I think this movie is a solid farewell to the character and a good epilogue for Breaking Bad. But I do have a couple of gripes, which I guess are more like nitpicks, but I'll just say them in the video so you know. One is that I do think there are a little too many flashbacks, and especially the one with Todd goes on for a very long time, taking up a good chunk of the runtime, and I would have preferred it to stay in the present timeline and deal with what Jesse is dealing with now, as well as a few other things. For instance, I am shocked that this movie, we did not see Brock. Now, at the end of the movie, Jesse does write a letter in order to be delivered to him, but considering Brock now has no parents in the picture and his mom was literally shot and killed in the most disgustingly unjustifiable way ever, and how much Jesse has cared for him throughout seasons 3, 4, and 5 since he's met him, I'm just really surprised that Brock wasn't a huge plot point. I get that the actor probably got a lot older, but I mean, you could recast a younger kid in the role. I also know there's nothing Jesse could really do. It's not like he had a bunch of extra money to give him, or it's not like he could just take him with him and take him up to Alaska, but at least going to see Brock or check on him in some way, I don't know. It would have been nice to see these two characters at least be able to have a moment together. The only other thing I would say that, although I really enjoy this film, and I think that Aaron Paul does an amazing job carrying it, and I really do think that you could make a Jesse Pinkman show because he is that good. But at the end of the day, I don't think that anything that happens in the movie is huge enough that it needed to be told. Don't get me wrong, I like the movie, and after revisiting it, I'm really glad that I watched it again. But Breaking Bad ends in a pretty perfect way, and I would have assumed that Jesse was going to find a way to make it out of town and to stay hidden. El Camino is just here to confirm that. So is the movie needed? No. But is it fun and a good epilogue to Jesse? Absolutely. And seeing Jesse in the lead is something special. Obviously, I would never want them to beat a dead horse with this universe, and after this and Better Call Saul, it's probably best that they never go back to it again. But if they ever did decide to pick up with Jesse again with his new identity, like let's say they wait 20 years to go back to it, and now we have a show with Jesse the same age that Walter White was when Breaking Bad started. We got like a 50-year-old Aaron Paul. Say he's been living in Alaska, he's been hidden and out of the game for years, and then something crazy happens and he gets tangled up with crime again, but now we would have a much older, more seasoned, and smarter Jesse. I don't know. You could just call the show Pinkman. Nah, I don't know. It would probably suck, but just some food for thought. Anyways, guys, let me know what you think of the movie El Camino in the comments. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you somewhere in the middle? Let me know, and please don't forget to like the video on your way out as well, because it will help me with the algorithm. I would appreciate it. Other than that, guys, thanks a lot for joining me on my Breaking Bad revisit journey. I wasn't going to do a video for El Camino, but those of you that did support the Breaking Bad videos were asking about it, and I figured, what the hell, I'm here to please. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching this. Like, comment, subscribe. I'll talk to you next time.